This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. We've been having a few technological problems. One of our computers that we use for Zoom is rather old, and the USB cables don't register very well, so we can't unmute the camera. So that's a challenge in the first place. And then one of our programs stopped halfway. So this is a replacement for what we had on Sunday. So we run it again and see what we can do. The Sunday program was oriented to a remnant prairie near St. Joe. And the Kickapoo Trail people had enlisted other people from Grand Prairie Friends, from Master Naturalists, from Audubon or Natural Area Study Group or Independence to meet at Policeman's Road, which is a road that spins off from 150 just about a mile mile west of St. Joe. It's where there's a Pioneer Grain Company on the north side of the road, and there's a little square entrance to the Policeman's Road. In the past, roads like that that met at a Y came out as a Y, but I think the system is to try and get you to meet another road at right angles. So you miss that if you're not very careful. A new road has been placed straight through. We talked a little bit about the cutoff. There's a big meander that goes through St. Joe. Meanders are a sigmoid curve. That's an S-shaped curve. And the node will gradually move down the river over 1,000 years, but it moves less east and west than the amplitude part of the sigmoid curve. If you go in that straight road, the more recent road to St. Joe, you can see that there is a beach area and a raised area, which is where the salt fork has been cutting in and creating a bank. There is housing on that section, so you can see that it's probably 15, 20 feet higher than the surrounding. So it carves on that side and dumps on the other side. So if you want to have a beach party, you have it on the side where gravel dumps or sand dumps. The river has been channelized. So although the railroad was installed fairly early, probably in the 50s, late 50s, that's late 1850s. It's fairly near the node part of the sigmoid curve. And so that bridge goes across the salt fork there, and it's been completed and converted to a bridge trail with fences on either side so you don't fall off of it. And it's welded into the beams of the I-beams of the railroad bridge that were there in the first place. The bridge happens to be a fairly new bridge, so it's a substantial bridge crossing. The railroad came first, and then roads came later. But there is a bridge for a road, as the pedestals are still there. And then when electricity came, the interurban went on the south side of the railroad line. So you have three roads or three corridors and three separate bridges. The middle one is the most recently occupied by the Conrail. It has been many different railroads. Big Four was one of them, one of the early ones. Well, between that bridge and the Pioneer Grain Company, there is a corridor about a mile long, which hasn't been mown excessively. It has grown some trees, and it's cherished as a remnant prairie. The plants are beginning to grow back out. There are still some trees. It's near the river, and most of the trees in Champaign County, or other counties too, that are in prairie, are along the river front. And the soils tend to be river soils or more clay soils. So you have prairie species, but you also have some forest species, and those that know can pick them up. There has been some inventory of the plants that are there. But if you're going to do a good inventory on a railroad corridor or anywhere else, you have to do it when at various months in the year. So you pick up the plants that grow in spring and summer and fall. And that's not always done. Often it's done at peak flowering time, July, August, and you get an inventory for that period. But to do that, you not only have to do it over the seasons, but you have to do it sometimes diurnally. Diurnally means that in the 24 hours, some plants will flower differently. So you do diurnally, you do daily, and that's organized to do it by season and to do it several years, because some plants don't exhibit themselves every year. They may be rich in one year and not rich in the next year. So for a good inventory, you need many visits to that location. But by the seat of the pants, it's fairly obvious that this is a remnant prairie. Let's define a remnant prairie. A remnant prairie is not an arboretum. If you have 110 species in an Illinois prairie, that means that the prairie generally over the state will have about 110 species. That doesn't mean that every corridor or every location will have 110 species. Some may be remnant prairies that only have 2, 3, or 4, 5, or 30 or 50 species. It's depending on the number of niches or habitat spaces that plants and animals can occupy. So if you are trying to find out what a remnant prairie is, you also have to sample the universe of that prairie. You have to go throughout the state and find different niches. You might find a swampy area. You might find a an area which is rich in calcium. You might find a sandy soil or a clay soil or loess, which is blown across the state when glaciers retreated. We don't have many samples of remnant prairies. The soil was first of all thought to be rather poor because it didn't support trees. But eventually people started to plant in it and realized that it was a very rich soil. So there's very little of it left. So we, apart from Gleason and Vestal and others, early ecologists, we don't always know what a remnant prairie was. Those people have long since passed or left, and many of these remnant sites don't exist anymore. So the only remnant sites that we have that are very good are 3 in this region, 3 cemetery prairies, one at Rankin, one at Prospect or Paxton, and one at Loda. And they're fairly representative of a remnant prairie. They're also biologically rich. They're interesting because they express themselves differently because a different prairie will be on a different soil type and with perhaps a different rain shadow or a rainfall. The other place that you find remnant prairies is along railroad lines. So being interested in prairies, we have gathered up old railroad beds for the prairie that's on the ballast. If you remove that ballast, you will also have original soil. And most important to us is original soil. But easy enough to be removed is the prairie soil. And that gets to be disappointing because it looks like weeds and nobody's really thinking too much about the soil. Instant the fact that they use fertilizer and use herbicides and insecticides and pesticides to grow crops, but that also sterilizes the soil and leaves the soil disturbed. Luckily, when the railroad goes in, it goes in a linear fashion. The railroad builds its own railroad track by pulling trailers, and on those trailers there are 33 feet long pieces of steel that become the railroad. The advanced equipment has a crane on it. It swings around and pulls that piece of railroad onto the ties that have been set for the setting of the rails. Then the whole apparatus moves forward. When it retreats and takes the railroad out, it takes the railroad pieces by pieces and puts them on a long train, and it's the same system. The last train out takes up the rail. So you have fairly undisturbed right away on either side of the bed. Now, that's not all of it. If you take out the ballast, you have virgin soil. So in some places, if you've been to a railroad demolition and corn has been placed on the virgin soil, the soil where the ballast was will be 1 foot higher than the worn out soil and the fields around it. Not always so, but there is virgin soil there. Farmers would like to take that corridor and use it for 1 more acre of corn and soybeans. For them, for 6 generations, they have been removing the prairie. It is weeds, and for them, it looks like unused ground. So if we're going to do a railroad right away, we're looking for that area on either side of the ballast. Now, you have a trail, and some people would say, why do you want to be bothered about a trail? Well, it just happens that the railroad was fairly strict about people not digging it up. It didn't always happen, but they had the right to have the right of way. They would try to keep the trees off of it. When you put a railroad in and you're in swampy territory like Champaign County was, you have a ditch on either side. And so that allows the drainage of the ballast, and the ballast is often higher than the surrounding land. It makes for a good bicycle trail, a hiking trail, and also if you don't mess up the side of the ballast with riprap, you have original prairie and original prairie soil. Biologists look for that. Now, at St. Joe, on that Policeman Road, there is a mile of fairly undisturbed soil on the north side of the railroad bed. It has been protected by the Policeman's Road, which was the original highway, 150 highway. It's narrow. It was an older highway, the bigger highway that goes straight through St. Joe, and it does also obey some of the natural history. The bottomlands that are occupying that sigmoid curve that we talk about have been planted to bottomland trees, and that's conservation area too. But going back to the road, there's not much traffic. There's a couple of houses and some farm buildings on that corridor. It's protected a little bit by the fact that there's not only a road, but a railroad line, and there's an interurban. The interurban went in probably about 1905, and it brought electricity to the communities like St. Joe. The interurban was a tram with 1 or 2 cars, usually 1. The rail bed was narrow. It was only 37 feet when the railroad mainline bed might be 100 feet, or if it's in a short line grain line, it might be 67 feet or something like that, 65 feet. But the fact that it had electricity is helpful because you can't have trees under electrical lines. They short to the power lines and cause fire. That's been a real problem out west. If you let it get to be too native, that means that if in the future we want to think about prairie on that corridor, then we might think about working with Ameren, who now owns that corridor, and the power lines are still there, and the power lines provide power for St. Joe and Ogden and Fithian and Oakwood and into Danville. You had to have booster stations where you had some equipment that would generate electricity to boost the power at various places. You can see one of these booster stations at Fithian. You can see where the electric catenary went into the building and was allowed to pick up more electricity generated by a motor. I don't think it was steam generated, but it was would have been probably a diesel type motor. If it was late enough, I suspect it might have been coal powered, that it generated electricity. First of all, there was DC current, which drops off fairly quickly. So you had to have more generation stations for DC, but very shortly they discovered AC power, and AC you don't need quite so many power situations. Okay, so we have that corridor somewhat protected by the adjacent interurban, which, if we were thinking about it, we would work with Ameren to put in prairie there. Well, it's already there. It's remnant prairie. It was put in when there was prairie. And we would tend to favor not having it herbicided, so that that prairie would keep and be something that we could recognize as remnant. Well, buying the railroad bed is helpful because there were so many railroads being taken out by the Steigers Act in the 1980s. It allowed grain lines, especially, that were obsolete because they had small elevators, small sidings, and super markets were generated, super elevators were generating a different sort of retail organization. If you go to Anderson's or on the way to Mahomet from Champaign, there's a huge generator of a storage of grain, and with 3 or so sidings that you can put 125 cars together. Whereas little elevators, you might only be able to put 12 or 15, and you would have to collect them and put them together for a mainline train. So things have changed, and lines were allowed to abandon, and they were consumed by adjacent owners or people who wanted to buy trails. The question would arise, why would you buy trails if one of your major interests is in a mission that is to preserve prairie? Well, the only place we have left to buy is on old railroad beds, or on active railroad beds for that matter. So we do buy up railroad beds for that purpose. And since the Congress decided that, especially where they were connecting railroads, like between Champaign and Danville, they would protect, that would be a major protection as distinct from the abandonment of short line grain lines. The advantage is there that the Congress was looking at people, bikers and hikers and biologists, buying railroad beds. And they decided that that was a good idea, because if they wanted to create a railroad corridor in the future, say 100 years' time, there were going to be mountains of opposition and there was going to be a cost. So better to provide the hikers, bikers, and biologists with the opportunity to buy the railroad bed in an in a manner that would allow the railroads to come back in if necessary. And they would provide the buyers with money to convert that railroad bed into an interim trail. Now, interim trail means it might be able to come back within 6 years because you needed it. Very few of these trails, these corridors have come back that way. They're almost a dead certainty to be a permanent fixture. So it was for the federal government cheaper to give the corridor between Banner and Danville $12 million to work on the corridor than it was to sell the land and buy back in 100 years' time. So it's a cooperative venture. And part of the reason why we have trails is that we have prairie nowhere else. Part of the problem then is that you have establishments who are in charge of engineering railroads and or engineering rail trails, and they get to be super wide, and that takes out most of the original vegetation and the animals that go with it. So we have this battle. It goes on in various places, but it especially wide when it goes through communities. They like to have the lawns mown on either side, so there's not much prairie there anyway. But in many cases, we would like to have the prairie come up onto the railroad bed and be preserved. Now, last Sunday's presentation was about this particular railroad bed at St. Joe, but it didn't succeed, so it was replaced by an earlier program where we discussed these railroad beds. And for some people who are interested in nature and nurture, the emphasis on railroads is not in keeping with their interest in preserving the prairie that is on them. There are objections to the wide trails and traffic and the cost of doing that. The Kickapoo Trail at the moment is running about $20 million. And that probably will be more as you emphasize rest stops and informational activities and the like. The cost now is high, but it will be spread over many generations, and the cost per capita or cost per person will be relatively low. But without it, you don't have any prairie. It goes back to corn and soybeans. The comments that I got from people who were expecting to have a discussion on the policeman trail were faced with the fact that we were talking about railroad intersections between Danville, Champaign-Urbana, Monticello, and Decatur. So why the emphasis on rail? Well, it's fairly obvious. That's the only place we have any prairie left, and what's there has been subject to fertilizer, wind distribution, and some herbicides, and so it's not the best, and some of it's weedy, and some of it has trees, but it's all we have. If you want to maintain that, then you have to be careful that you don't destroy it. So when people met on Monday, a week ago, Monday, some of the discussion was there are invasive species. Yes, there's autumn olive and honeysuckle and what have you. But there amongst the few trees that are left are prairie plants. And so what you do here has to do with volunteers who want to help. And that's wonderful. One of the things that you have to do is you have to work with a population that's got a neatness syndrome. So if you take out a tree, you need to get rid of it. You need to send it somewhere else. But if you are naturalists, you will probably leave the tree where it falls, and the prairie will grow up with it. To some people, that is very unneat. And so then there's a question of, should we pile it up and burn it? And I say, no, I don't want the soil microorganisms sterilized in one place. So then the question is, well, it's only one place. Well, it's only one big piece of the very small amount of prairie we have left. So if you want to get rid of it, you have to convince the owners of the railbed, now the Forest Preserve and the Vermilion County Conservation District, you have to convince them to come with a 5-ton truck and take the vegetation out. And often you can mulch it, you can cut it up, and it can be used as mulch and can be sold. So it's not a dead loss, but it's a different way of doing things. So the prairie then looks neat and tidy. And then there's the temptation to look at a remnant prairie with its 2, 5, 10, 15, 25, 30, 50 species in it and think, it looks rather daggy, it looks rather weedy. Well, that goes along with most of the community that thinks a prairie looks like weeds, and it does. So, and that's in the culture of the society that's come here, whether you be Norwegian or Polish or Italian or French, you do your own interpretation of it, but it has to be gotten out in order to provide economic base. We've tended since colonial time, or even before that, to concentrate on the money that comes from a resource rather than on how you might retain the resource for future generations. So we've taken out all that we have, all our insects, all our birds. Graeber and Graeber did a survey of the state, and really the most prominent bird was an aluminum-based airplane flying over top. The birds were numerous, perhaps in Shawnee Town or in Shawnee Forest, where some nature has been retained and the federal government has been buying up not very good grade land for restoration. We can keep doing that. We can keep burning a patch for a burn pile, and we lose a little bit of prairie. So I'm anxious to see that any invasive species either be left where they are or they be transported out. There is a burn pile within a quarter of a mile of this corridor that could be used. It's a city burn pile, so it is official, and it has sterilized the area it's on, and people know about it and can drive in. Or you just leave it there and teach people that a down tree is aesthetically wonderful. You're going to have grubs and other creatures utilize it, and so a down tree doesn't necessarily look like an ugly tree. It looks like restoration is in process. The other tempting thing to do is to smarten up the remnant prairie by planting in native seed, but then you don't know what a prairie remnant is. So you've taken out forever the possibility of knowing what this particular remnant produced. And there are certain plants that grow well and express themselves well. Some of them are, black-eyed Susan is one of them. And there are a number of rough and tough prairie plants that can augment such a site. If we do that with the 10 miles between St. Joe and Ogden and Fithian and Oakwood, then we're going to take a huge amount of our original prairie out. The answer to that is, but I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about the individual trees and the individual place. Well, if you're in St. Louis, the botanical gardens there, or if you're in England with Kew Gardens, the primary mission is to preserve the seed and the plants of the world before they go. We've got rid of about half of them already. So their mission is to preserve the dignity of what was. It's not to create a prairie. They do that. If it's a forest, it's an ocean, it's an ecosystem. They try to keep it natural. They will plant around the Kew Gardens an arboretum where you can either create niches, or some plants will exist with niches that are they're more adaptable, so they can adapt to several different niches. So people can go to Kew Gardens and walk around and see plants from different countries. There might be a greenhouse where you create a climate for certain plants. But the intention of the organization is to preserve the prairie. So those people who are volunteers who would like to help to remove the invasive vegetation and improve the site with seed have to know that there is a level of concern. They might not be interested in that level of concern. Somebody has to be interested. And if you're going to have people who organize the infrastructure for removing invasive trees and plants, then they have to have some sympathy, some understanding of the ecosystem that you're working with, and you have to understand those people who are world leaders who are trying their best to keep together some individual plants, but also ecosystems. Not easy. And we have leaders that do that. So if you're going to organize a docent group, you have to have someone who understands what it is. If you're going to sell hats at a haberdashery, you need to have some skills in making hats. You have to have an imagination. You have to have a recognition of what a decent hat is. But if you're going to organize 200 people to make hats, then you're going to have to give up a lot of your physical, mental workday activities. You become an organizer. So the docent organizer is very, very important. Here with the Natural Area Study Group, we had a woman named Anne Fireholm, and she put together the Natural Area Study Group. And she left town, but the Natural Area Study Group continues. But there are people who are knowledgeable of certain natural areas that the study group will take people to. So yes, it's good to have a plan for what you're doing and to know what the basis of it is and why we have corridors. So yes, we do have corridors. Let me repeat them. And if you are willing, you'll reach out for your local road map and you'll know where I'm going. I'm talking on a radio. So sometimes we're also doing video on Channel 6 and video on YouTube. So the video, I can put maps and charts in. But in order to do that, I have to have people like David Whitsonny who help me to put in maps that indicate where there are certain organisms, or might even be an endangered species. We need to know that inventory, but the technology is needed to put the map in. The simplest technology is to take your road atlas and know where Danville is and where Champaign-Urbana is and Decatur is, and where Clinton is and where Bloomington is and where Paris is. So as I talk, it gets confusing if you don't know the territory. Even better is for you to get a satellite feed and go along with me. So if I start at Decatur, then we can follow through. So let's do that for a moment, because we're concerned with an excess or a feeling that there's an excess of concern for railroads. Well, yes, indeed. We start off at Decatur, come through Oriana and Argenta and Cisco to Monticello. It's not clean and simple. there's a short line, grain line, and it's been rumored that may sometime close out. If it does, that will be the opportunity to have a hike and bike corridor trail from Decatur to Monticello. At the moment, the old Route 47 was highway to Decatur from Monticello, or from Decatur to Monticello. It's wide, and it could carry a shared bicycle trail. It can be a speed track, but it doesn't have to be. But it goes through what were the traditional towns that are about 5 miles apart. Elevator here and there. So you get to Monticello, and you have 7 miles of active railroad line that belongs to the Monticello Railroad Museum. So please, now, as you are looking at your road map, you'll see 7 miles between Monticello and Whiteheath. At each end of that 7 miles, there is a triangle which allows the Railroad Museum to turn a train on a triangle so that the engine will be in front. The corridor is complicated by the fact that the Railroad Museum actually occupied the parallel interurban. They didn't know that the main line was going to close out. When the main line closed out, then the main line became their tourist attraction. Now, once again, you have the question, tourist attraction. There's not the natural area, but it is the natural area. In urban situations, it may not be the natural area, but it has urban bicycle trail on it in Monticello, but that saves the soil and it saves the prairie. Not always, because the prairie takes a long time to grow, and it grows with weeds for 5 years or 10 years. And it's very tempting to take it out and mow it and make it a lawn. So we have to care about our railroad beds. Another offshoot at Monticello is from Monticello down to Bement, an old interurban line, which is mown, and people are very proud that it is mown. But if you didn't mow it, it's alive with original soil and prairie plants. So there's this argument, and often at a political level, recreation trumps preservation. And so a forest preserve could actually have more right to work with recreation than it does have to have work with preservation. The conservation district in Vermilion County has more right to do preservation work. So these are political cats that at the federal or state level, there's been a movement to allow people to use these corridors for exercise, for connectivity with little towns, to have business, and certainly they upgrade the communities. But at the same time, they're preserving prairies. And we have to emphasize that, and we have to know how to work with these agencies, these towns, these cities, these places that are resources for Champaign County, because Champaign County doesn't have a Clinton Lake, it doesn't have a Weldon Springs, or an Allerton Park, or a Lodge Park, or a Shady Rest, or Rock Home Gardens at Decatur. Or so we tend to use other counties. So when I go to speak to a city about this, I'm speaking about something that's way outside its jurisdiction, but the people who are in this jurisdiction are utilizing corridors outside of town, or landscapes or terrains or whatever you call them. So many of our people go to Vermilion County and go to places like Conkey Town and have weekenders, and same goes for Bloomington, where you go to Leroy, and north of Leroy there's a Moraine State Park. So we utilize the other counties, don't always pay them for what they're doing. The state will pay for the upgrade of the Clinton Lake, for instance, or so there's money floating around, but there is a political reason for these resources being there and for them to be preserved. Some agencies, like the Sierra Club, are more involved with politics, and more likely to be going off to Springfield to speak to their state representative, or going to the federal government and preserving resources. The resources are often owned by the nation. They're not owned by one individual state. We have at the moment manatees in Florida, but they're the manatees for the whole United States. And so if you're going to lose your kelp beds that are the grazing grounds for manatees, then you are responsible for a nation. And if you're in a prairie, you're responsible for a prairie that other people will never see their heritage. So if you're in Fithian and there's a Fithian Railroad depot, an interurban depot, there's a elevator, and there used to be Dr. Fithian, who owned a lot of land to the north and the south and kept livestock. And if you have coal nearby and underground coal mines or open strip mines, these are the histories you need to know about in order to keep those corridors that are keeping our prairie together. So it becomes very important that you pay attention to the railroad beds as they close out. We just lost one in the Arcola, Paris, Decatur area that's went back to farming. And most of the farmers don't realize that then in that corridor is the genetics of the plants that we might need for their biochemicals, or even plants for the future. We spend each year planting annual soybeans, but if you had a perennial soybean, the erosion would be much less. So where would it come from? You have to have a plant that's growing in the prairie or growing in some other ecosystem that is preserved. Some other societies may want to come to our ecosystem, if it exists, to take a plant from our ecosystem and find a biochemical that will prevent a heart attack or something. We need these ecosystems, but at the moment, the only way we can pay for them is through the Federal Rail Banking Act and interim trail use. So when you're working on a prairie at St. Joe, you have to, in the background, realize that the use of this trail is also preserving your prairie. There are places where you can restore. The people who have a mission of going to preserve the original also have a respect for people who do the restoration. Now, when you want to widen the road, and it's not going to be very popular to widen it into a cornfield, you widen it into the railroad bed. And if there's a bird bath that's low and it gets to be covered in water as a 5-inch rainfall, then you utilize the obvious weeds that are on the ballast or on the right-of-way next door to you. So we can lose that original prairie. Sometimes groups like the Grand Prairie Friends have been allowed to harvest plants. Harvesting plants is a good idea if you want an instant prairie, but it takes a lot of energy to harvest a big blue stem plant that might be 30 years old, and you have to have shovels on all 4 sides, and you have to pop the roots and hope that the roots will grow in another hole that you create somewhere else. So some salvage has been taken place there. Not always successful. If you're wanting to transfer hoary cocoon or some of those plants that are very specific and have associated organisms, sometimes they're fungi, sometimes they're bacteria, sometimes they're other plants. If you're going to take them as an individual plant to your backyard, they're not going to survive. So you're going to lose prairie when you do that. And at Falls especially, is an elevator before St. Joe, on the west side of St. Joe. There was a lot of remodeling. And you can remodel in 2 different ways. It's rather cheaper to put in a bulldozer with a laser beam on it and remodel the whole territory. There's another way of doing it is you sit a hi-ho on the side, and if you need to remove 4 inches, you remove 4 inches and leave some of the topsoil. And the former type of plowing is cheaper and efficient, but it doesn't leave much topsoil, and it is sad to see that topsoil going somewhere else. Now, in the case of the Kickapoo Trail, some of that soil from the Kickapoo area, where there was good prairie, a native prairie, and here we're talking about remnant prairie, went to Homer Lake. I think it's probably about 6 miles, and they took quite a few truckloads of the topsoil and planted it on a cornfield, and it is growing as near to remnant prairie as you would want. The seed is in the soil, the topsoil is there, and especially if it rains at the right time, you're in good shape. There's also a chance for you to sow. And if you sow, you've got to be careful that you're not sowing cheap seed from Kansas. You're sowing Illinois ecosystem, or you harvest what was there and bring it back after the landscape modification. So that requires you knowing where you're getting your seed and when you plant it. Often it's planted in summertime when the construction agencies are there, which is not always ideal. So I think we've gotten to the end of the time. I've been chatting a long time, but think about your remnant prairies, think about the railroads that help to save your remnant prairies. And this is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And thanks to Banner Public Television, which helps us do this program.